Even the factory can't fix this." The female CEO folded her arms and stared at the dead production machine worth nearly $5 million. 3 senior engineers had spent 2 days trying to solve the problem. The manufacturer had already admitted defeat. The factory floor fell silent. No hum of conveyor belts, no rhythmic pulse of hydraulic pistons, just the kind of silence that costs money by the second. Then a quiet maintenance worker, a single father nobody paid attention to, stepped forward from the back of the room. He moved slowly, without urgency, without any visible awareness of how absurd his presence looked in that moment. "I think I know what's wrong." The engineers laughed. The CEO nearly asked security to remove him. 5 minutes later, the machine roared back to life. But what shocked everyone wasn't how he fixed it. It was why he knew the answer. Ethan Carter was 38 years old, and he had mastered the art of disappearing in plain sight. He wore the same dark navy work uniform every day, the same steel-toed boots worn soft at the heel, and he carried a thermos of black coffee that he never finished. He arrived for the night shift at 10 minutes to midnight, signed in without small talk, and moved through the halls of Hartwell Advanced Manufacturing, like a man who had long ago made peace with being invisible. His badge said Maintenance Technician, Level 2. His locker was in the far corridor near the old loading dock, away from the clusters of engineers and floor supervisors who gathered near the break room. Nobody sought him out. Nobody much thought about him at all. He was, in the eyes of his colleagues, simply the person who showed up when something broke a warm body with a wrench. Reliable in the way that a spare part is reliable, useful, replaceable, unremarkable. He lived in a small house on the east side of the city with a garden he kept tidy, and a garage full of tools arranged with a precision that would have surprised anyone who'd bothered to look. He had been a widower for 6 years. His wife, Laura, had died from an illness that moved fast and left no room for negotiation. She had been 31. He had been 32. There had been no children, and for that, on his darkest nights, he was sometimes quietly grateful, because he did not know how he would have managed the grief while also managing another human life. What he did instead was work. He worked nights and slept days and spent his evenings in the garage taking things apart and putting them back together, not because he needed to, but because it was the only language in which the world still made complete sense to him. The grief had taken many things. It had not taken his hands, and it had not taken the deep, almost cellular understanding of how mechanical systems think. His colleagues at Hartwell called him Quiet Ethan, not unkindly, but not with particular warmth either. He was the sort of man people acknowledged without truly seeing, the kind of presence that registers as background noise. Senior engineer Marcus Webb had worked alongside him for 2 years and still occasionally forgot his name, referring to him instead as the night guy in conversations with management. The floor supervisors respected his punctuality and the cleanliness of his work logs. Beyond that, Ethan Carter was scenery, and Ethan, for his part, seemed entirely content to remain so. 3 floors above him, in a corner office with floor-to-ceiling glass and a view of the entire production floor below, lived a very different kind of person. Sophia Bennett was 35 years old, and she had never in her life been content to remain anything. She had taken over as CEO of Hartwell Advanced Manufacturing at 32, a fact that still generated discussion in industry circles not because it was impossible, but because the speed of her ascent had left most people slightly breathless. She was sharp, deliberate, and possessed of an almost frightening ability to hold the full complexity of a business operation in her mind at once. She made decisions quickly and defended them completely. She expected the same from everyone around her. She had no patience for ambiguity, no tolerance for excuses, and a particular dislike for meetings that went longer than they needed to. She ran the company the way a surgeon runs an operating room, with the understanding that every second of delay is a second the patient is losing blood. The deal she was currently navigating was the largest in the company's history. A $140 million manufacturing contract with a defense and aerospace consortium that had been evaluating Hartwell for the better part of 8 months. The evaluation was nearly complete. The site visit from the consortium's lead procurement team was scheduled for 3 weeks out. Everything was moving exactly as it needed to move, The factory floor was producing at peak efficiency. The quality metrics were immaculate. Sophia had reviewed the numbers personally that morning and allowed herself, briefly, the quiet satisfaction of a person who has built something that works. Then, at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, Line 7 stopped. The alert came through on 3 systems simultaneously. The production management dashboard went red. The floor supervisor's radio crackled with the kind of controlled panic that experienced factory workers use when they are trying not to sound alarmed. And Sophia's phone lit up on her nightstand with a notification that she had pre-programmed for exactly this category of emergency, the kind that meant stop sleeping, start working. She was in the car within 12 minutes. She arrived at the factory at 12:31 in the morning to find 3 senior engineers already crouched around the primary control panel of the Line 7 production assembly system, a machine worth nearly $5 million and responsible for the most technically demanding stage of the manufacturing process. Without it, the entire line was dead. Without the line, the delivery timeline was broken. And without the delivery timeline, the consortium contract was, at minimum, in serious jeopardy. She stood at the edge of the floor and watched the engineers work, and she did not say anything, because she understood that the first thing to do in a crisis is observe before you speak. The machine was completely unresponsive. No error codes on the primary interface. No obvious physical damage. No smoke, no smell, no tripped breakers. It had simply stopped, as if someone had reached inside it and removed whatever fundamental will it had to keep running. The floor was quiet in the particular way that large industrial spaces go quiet when the machines stop a silence, so complete it feels almost architectural, like the absence of sound has weight and dimension. Marcus Webb, the lead engineer, looked up when Sophia approached. His expression told her everything before he said a word. "We've checked the software layer twice," he said. "Control system logs show no fault trigger. Power supply is nominal. We're running diagnostics on the sensor array now, but so far," he paused, "so far, nothing." Sophia nodded once. "How long?" Marcus glanced at his colleague. "To find the fault? Unknown. To restore production? Another pause. Also unknown." She pulled out her phone and called the head of operations. "Get me the manufacturer's emergency line," she said. "And I want the entire senior technical team on the floor by 6. She ended the call and looked at the machine. It looked back at her, dark and enormous and absolutely still. The hours that followed were a systematic dismantling of certainty. By 3 in the morning, 2 additional engineers had arrived and begun working through the electrical subsystems with methodical thoroughness. By 5, the sensor array had been fully tested and cleared. By 7, a specialist from the control software company had joined remotely and spent 90 minutes reviewing the system logs before concluding, with careful professional language, that the software was not the source of the failure. Each layer of the investigation peeled back to reveal only the next layer. And each next layer was equally clean, equally blameless, equally useless in explaining why a $5 million machine was sitting on the factory floor doing absolutely nothing. The financial implications were not abstract. The production manager had run the numbers by mid-morning and placed them quietly in front of Sophia on a single sheet of paper. Every hour of downtime on Line 7 cost the company between $80,000 and $100,000 in lost output and contractual exposure. By the time the manufacturer's emergency technical team joined the conversation, the clock had been running for nearly 15 hours. The number on that sheet of paper had already grown to something that required 7 digits. Sophia set the paper face down on the table and did not look at it again. The manufacturer's team arrived via video conference at 1 in the afternoon on the second day. There were 4 of them, serious, senior people with institutional knowledge of the specific system and access to engineering documentation that no one at Hartwell possessed. They asked good questions. They requested data logs going back 6 months. They had Hartwell's engineers run a series of targeted diagnostic tests in real time while they watched the results on their screens. The session lasted 4 hours. At the end of it, the lead technical specialist from the manufacturer's side cleared his throat and delivered his assessment in the flat, measured tone of a person who has practiced delivering bad news without visible emotion. The system, he explained, had experienced a failure mode they had not previously encountered in field deployment. The diagnostic tools they had available could not isolate the specific fault. The only reliable path forward, given the complexity of the failure and the inconclusive diagnostics, was to replace the primary control and interface module entirely, a process that would require parts to be manufactured and shipped, qualified installation technicians to be dispatched, and a full system recertification once the replacement was complete. The cost would exceed $1 million. The timeline would be, at minimum, 2 weeks. Possibly 3. Sophia listened to all of this without interrupting. When the specialist finished, she sat still for several seconds. Then she said, with the careful precision of a person choosing words like instruments, "Let me make sure I understand. Your team, with full access to the engineering documentation and 6 months of operational data, cannot identify the specific fault in this machine." The specialist nodded. "That is correct." Sophia looked at the machine through the conference room glass. It had not moved. It had no interest in moving. Then, she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone in the room, "Even the factory can't fix this." The phrase landed in the silence of the room and stayed there. Nobody argued with it. Nobody offered an alternative. The despair that had been quietly building over 32 hours of failed investigation settled into the room like sediment. Ethan had been standing near the back wall for the last 40 minutes. He had come in for his shift, been told about the crisis, and drifted toward the gathering the way water finds low ground, not urgently, not with any particular announcement, just present. He had listened to the manufacturer's team present their findings. He had watched the engineers absorb the news. And while everyone else in the room was processing the cost and the timeline and the contractual consequences, Ethan was looking at something else entirely. He was looking at a ventilation panel on the lower left quadrant of the machine housing. It was a small panel, roughly the size of a large book, secured with 4 standard fasteners. Nothing about it was remarkable. It was the kind of detail that a person who knew what they were looking for might notice, and that everyone else would simply not see. He had noticed it within the first 10 minutes of arriving on the floor. He had said nothing, because no one had asked. He raised his hand. It was such an unusual gesture in that environment. A maintenance worker raising his hand during a senior technical briefing that for a moment, nobody quite processed what they were seeing. Then Marcus Webb noticed, and his expression shifted from grief to mild contempt. "Carter," he said, in a tone that made the name sound like a category of error. "You need something?" Ethan spoke quietly. "I'd like to take a look at the machine." The room reacted the way rooms react when something unexpected and slightly absurd is introduced into a serious situation. A few engineers exchanged glances. Someone near the window made a sound that was almost a laugh, and then thought better of completing it. Marcus looked at him with the particular patience of a person explaining something obvious to someone who should already understand it. "Ethan, the manufacturer's team has been working on this for 4 hours. They have the full engineering schematics. They cannot find the fault." He paused for effect. "This isn't a lawnmower." Another engineer, younger, less careful, actually did laugh at that. A short, bright sound. Ethan didn't react to it. He kept his eyes on Sophia. Sophia had been watching Ethan with the particular focus she reserved for things she did not yet understand. She had not seen him before, or rather, she had seen him the way she saw all maintenance staff, which was to say she had registered his presence without cataloging his particulars. He was holding himself with a stillness that she found difficult to read. Not nervous, not eager, not the performative confidence of someone trying to be taken seriously. Just present. Just waiting. She was out of options. The manufacturer wanted $1 million and 3 weeks. The consortium visit was in 3 weeks. The number on that piece of paper was going to keep growing every hour. She looked at him for another moment. 5 minutes, she said. You have 5 minutes. The room watched him walk toward the machine with the muted anticipation of people who are watching something they expect to fail. Ethan did not open a laptop. He did not access the diagnostic interface. He did not pull up a schematic on his phone or consult any documentation of any kind. He crouched in front of the machine, and he listened to it. This was not a metaphor. He placed one hand flat against the lower housing and held it there for several seconds, feeling for vibration. Then he leaned his head slightly to the left and held still again, the way a person holds still when they are trying to hear something at the edge of audibility. He moved his palm slowly across 2 sections of the housing, comparing temperatures. The room watched him do this with expressions ranging from skepticism to active disdain. Marcus crossed his arms. The young engineer who had laughed looked at his phone. What Ethan was doing was not guesswork. It was the product of nearly 15 years of working with complex electromechanical systems at a level that most people in that room could not fully access, because most people in that room had learned these systems from documentation. Ethan had, at a certain point in his life, helped design systems like this, systems built on the same foundational architecture, using the same categories of thermal management and vibration isolation. He knew, with the kind of knowledge that lives in the hands and not in the head, that a machine of this class, when it fails silently with no error codes and no obvious fault, is almost always failing because of something invisible to software and invisible to standard diagnostics. The diagnostics look at what the machine reports. They cannot see what the machine does not know to report. He moved to the lower left panel. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a small screwdriver. Not a diagnostic tool, not anything impressive, just a standard flathead screwdriver worn smooth at the handle from years of use. He removed the 4 fasteners with practiced efficiency and set the panel aside. He looked at what was inside for perhaps 15 seconds. Then he removed a small secondary component, a thermal coupling relay, roughly the size of a deck of playing cards, and examined it carefully. He pressed a specific contact point with his thumb and held it. He looked at the contact surface, tilted the component slightly toward the overhead light. Then he reached into the same breast pocket and produced a small contact cleaner and a precision cloth. He worked on the component for approximately 90 seconds. He reseated it. He made a single, small adjustment to a connector bracket with the same flathead screwdriver, a quarter turn, no more. He replaced the panel. He fastened it back into position. He stood up and he looked at Sophia. "You can restart the system now," he said. The room was quiet. Nobody moved. Sophia looked at him for a moment, then at the machine, then back at him. She was not a person who made decisions based on sentiment, but she was also, and this was one of the things that had made her exceptional, a person who could recognize the texture of genuine competence, even when it arrived in unexpected packaging. She nodded at the floor supervisor. The supervisor hesitated. Marcus started to say something. Sophia raised one hand, and Marcus stopped. The supervisor moved to the primary restart panel. He entered the authorization sequence. He pressed the initiation control. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. The room held its collective breath in the particular way that rooms hold breath when something is about to either succeed completely or fail completely, and there is no possible middle ground. Then the primary interface lit up, green across the board. Then the control system initialized sequence by sequence, function by function, each indicator stepping from dark to active in the precise cascade that meant the system was whole and operational. Then the conveyor drive engaged. Then the assembly actuators cycled through their startup sequence. Then line 7, which had been dead for 33 hours and 40 minutes and had been declared unfixable by the people who built it, began to run. The sound of it filled the factory floor. It was the most expensive sound most people in that room had ever heard. Nobody spoke. The young engineer who had laughed was not laughing. Marcus Webb was staring at the operational display with an expression that cycled through several emotions in rapid succession and settled on something that was not quite shame but was close to it. Sophia stood at the edge of the room and felt the particular sensation that comes when a certainty you have been holding dissolves completely and is replaced by something you did not see coming. She watched the line run for approximately 30 seconds, confirming it was nominal, and then she turned to look at Ethan. He was already moving to close his tool case. "What?" she said. "Did you just do?" He looked up. The thermal coupling relay in the lower service bay had developed an oxide layer on the primary contact surface. The machine was getting intermittent thermal misreads. It was shutting down as a safety response. He paused. The diagnostic software reports what the sensors tell it. The sensors thought the machine was overheating, so the machine kept turning itself off. But nothing was actually overheating. The sensor was just dirty. Sophia stared at him. That's it, he said. The question that Sophia could not stop turning over through the rest of that afternoon, through the evening, through a night during which she slept poorly and woke early, was not how he had found it. It was how he had known where to look. The engineers had been thorough. The manufacturer's team had been expert. Nobody had touched that panel. It was not in the standard diagnostic sequence. There was nothing in the operational documentation that would have directed a technician to check a thermal coupling relay as a first-order intervention in this failure mode. You would only go there if you already knew, from somewhere deep in your accumulated experience, that this was where the answer lived. Sophia had spent enough time around technically sophisticated people to recognize the difference between learned competence and embedded knowledge. What she had watched Ethan do was not troubleshooting. It was recognition. He had looked at the machine and, within minutes, known what it was trying to tell him. That was a different order of ability entirely. She went to HR the following morning and asked for Ethan Carter's complete personnel file. The HR director, slightly puzzled by the personal interest, pulled it and brought it to her office. Sophia set her coffee aside and read it. She read it again, and then she sat with it for a long moment, in the way that a person sits when they have encountered information that requires them to significantly revise something they thought they understood. Ethan's current employment record at Hartwell was 3 years of maintenance work. Competent, reliable, completely unremarkable. Before Hartwell, a 2-year gap no employer listed. Before the gap, a series of entries that Sophia had to read twice to fully process. Senior Systems Design Engineer at a major defense technologies firm. Lead architect on a propulsion control interface project that had, she knew, become an industry standard. Co-inventor on 4 patents related to electromechanical thermal management systems. The specific category of engineering that sat at the heart of what she had watched him fix in 5 minutes. Recipient of a National Engineering Innovation Award. Headhunted by 2 Fortune 100 companies in the same calendar year. And then, nothing. The gap. And then Hartwell Advanced Manufacturing. Maintenance Technician, Level 2. The application listed his relevant experience in the vaguest possible terms. He had not lied. He had simply chosen not to mention most of the truth. Sophia put the file down and looked out through the glass at the production floor below, where Line 7 was running with perfect, unbroken efficiency. She thought about the $5 million machine. She thought about the 33 hours. She thought about the $1 million replacement quote and the 3-week timeline and the consortium contract and everything that had been balanced on the edge of an outcome she had been powerless to change. And then she thought about a man who had quietly watched all of it from the back of the room, who had known the answer the whole time, and who had said nothing until someone gave him 5 minutes. She picked up her phone and called the front desk. "Find Ethan Carter," she said. "Ask him if he has a few minutes. Tell him I'd like to talk." The office that Sophia used for private meetings was different from her main workspace. It was smaller, with a round table rather than a desk, and a window that looked out over the parking lot rather than the factory floor. She had chosen it deliberately for conversations. She wanted to feel like conversations rather than proceedings. When Ethan arrived on time, without apparent anxiety, in his work uniform because he had apparently come directly from the floor, he sat down across from her and set his hands flat on the table in the manner of a person who does not fidget. Sophia had prepared several ways to begin. She discarded all of them. "Why didn't you say anything?" she asked. Ethan considered this. Not the way people consider things when they are formulating a defense, but the way people consider things when they are deciding how much honesty the situation actually calls for. "Nobody asked," he said. "I didn't say anything because no one was asking the night maintenance guy for input on a $5 million machine failure." Sophia looked at him. "And the patents? The design work? You chose not to put any of that on your application." "I chose to take a maintenance job," he said. "The skills are in my hands regardless of what the application says." She leaned back slightly. "What happened?" she asked. Not meaning his career. Meaning the gap. Meaning the 2 years between the engineering awards and the maintenance badge. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He looked at the window, not at her. "My wife died," he said. He said it simply, without decoration, in the tone of a person who has long since finished performing the grief and now lives quietly inside it. "I spent about 2 years figuring out what I wanted the rest of my life to look like. I came to understand that I didn't want to lead projects anymore. I didn't want to manage teams, or give presentations, or fly to conferences. I wanted to work with my hands in a place where the stakes were manageable and the commute was short." He paused. "I wanted quiet. I found it here." Sophia absorbed this. She was 35 years old and had spent the entirety of her adult life pursuing elevation, more responsibility, more visibility, more impact. The idea of choosing invisibility was not something she had previously considered as a legitimate option. She looked at the man across from her and felt something that was not quite pity and not quite admiration, but was somewhere in the territory between them. "You're one of the most technically capable people in this building," she said. "Possibly in this industry." He didn't seem particularly moved by this. "The machine works," he said. "That's what matters." But Sophia was not satisfied with that as an ending. Because she had learned something in that round table room, with the parking lot outside the window and the coffee going cold between them, that she had not previously known how to articulate. She had built a company on the assumption that talent announces itself, that the most capable people are the ones who seek visibility, who pursue advancement, who make their abilities known through the normal channels of professional assertion. It was a reasonable assumption. It was also, she now understood, dangerously incomplete. The most capable person in her building had been invisible for 3 years, not because he lacked ability, but because the system she had built rewarded visibility over substance, title over competence, the performance of expertise over the thing itself, and she had nearly paid $1 million and lost a $140 million contract because of it. She looked at Ethan for a long moment. "I want to offer you a role," she said. "Not because I'm trying to do something for you, because I'm trying to do something for this company." She slid a single sheet of paper across the table. "Special technical advisor. You would consult on complex system failures, evaluate our maintenance and quality control protocols, and advise the engineering team on system architecture decisions. Flexible hours. You work when you work. No management responsibilities unless you want them." Ethan picked up the paper and read it. He read it the way he did everything carefully, without rushing. Then he set it down. "I'll think about it," he said. Sophia nodded. "Take as long as you need." As he stood to leave, she said, "One more question. When you came forward in that room, when Webb laughed, did it bother you?" Ethan stopped at the door and considered this for a moment with genuine thoughtfulness. "No," he said. "I knew what I knew." His opinion of what I knew didn't change what I knew. He left the office quietly. Sophia sat with that for a long time. He called her office 3 days later and said yes. He had conditions. He kept his own schedule. He worked on specific problems rather than in a general advisory capacity, and he did not attend meetings that did not require his technical input. Sophia agreed to all of them without negotiation, which was unusual for her, but she had decided that the correct response to finding something rare was not to standardize it. She announced the new role to the leadership team without drama or elaborate explanation. Marcus Webb received the news with an expression that took visible effort to arrange into something appropriate. The engineering team received it with varying degrees of surprise and, in the case of the younger engineers, a kind of quiet interest the news had spread. As news always spreads in a factory, with speed and specificity, and most of the floor already knew who had fixed Line 7 and how. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Hartwell had previously experienced in the category of technical problem-solving. Ethan moved through the factory, the way he had always moved through it quietly, without announcement, but now when he stopped to examine something, people stopped with him and paid attention. He had a way of identifying latent system vulnerabilities that was, as one younger engineer described it, slightly uncanny. He would pause at a piece of equipment and say something like, "This bearing assembly is going to fail within 60 days." And when the team investigated, they would find the early indicators of precisely the failure he had predicted. He did not explain his reasoning elaborately. He was not a teacher by nature. But the engineers who shadowed him began, over time, to absorb something of how he looked at machines, not as collections of documented components, but as integrated systems with their own behaviors, their own tendencies, their own ways of communicating distress before the point of failure. It was a form of attention that could not be downloaded from a manual. The consortium visit arrived 3 weeks after Line 7 came back to life. The procurement team toured the facility on a Thursday morning, and Sophia walked them through the factory floor with the careful precision of a person who has done the preparation and knows it. Line 7 ran at full capacity throughout the visit. The metrics were exactly what they needed to be. The team asked technical questions that Sophia answered directly, and for 2 of the more complex system architecture questions, she turned without hesitation to Ethan, who was standing quietly at the back of the group, and who answered both questions with a brevity and precision that the procurement team's lead engineer found visibly impressive. At lunch afterward, the lead engineer asked Sophia how long her special technical advisor had been with the company. 3 years, she said. He nodded slowly. You should hold on to him, he said. The contract was signed 6 weeks later. $140 million. At the company-wide meeting that Sophia convened in the spring, all departments, all shifts, the full breadth of Hartwell's workforce gathered in the main assembly building for the first time since the facility had expanded 3 years earlier. She spent the first part of the meeting walking through the company's performance, the contract win, the growth trajectory. She thanked the teams that had made it possible with the specificity that good leaders use when they want people to know they are genuinely seen. And then she paused, and she told a story. She told it without slides, without prepared remarks, standing at the front of the room in the particular stillness that comes over a person who is about to say something true. She described Line 7. She described the 33 hours. She described the manufacturer's team and the $1 million quote and the words she had said in that conference room. Even the factory can't fix this, and she said them again now without embarrassment, because the point was not to protect her credibility, but to make the lesson honest. She described a man raising his hand from the back of the room. She described 5 minutes and a flathead screwdriver and a thermal coupling relay with an oxide layer on the contact surface. The room was very quiet. People who had been there remembered it precisely. People who hadn't been there had heard versions of the story. But there is a difference between the story and the person it happened to standing in front of you telling it. The person who saved this company, Sophia said, was not the most expensive expert in the room. He was not the most senior person. He did not have the most impressive title or the most elaborate credentials visible on his employment file. She paused. Every face in the room was turned toward her. He was the only person paying enough attention to see what was actually there. The room looked for Ethan. He was standing near the side wall, arms crossed, watching the floor with the mild expression of a man who finds this slightly more attention than he requires. Sophia looked at him, and for a moment their eyes met. And she said, "The biggest mistake in business isn't missing a problem. It's overlooking the person who already knows the solution." The applause was the kind that starts slowly and builds because people need a moment to understand what they are clapping for. Ethan did not raise his hand in acknowledgement. He did not smile for the room. He nodded once, the compact, honest nod of a person who has heard something accurate and is confirming it, and then he looked back at the floor. Around him, the factory hummed. Every line was running. Every system was whole. the work was being done, and the work was good, and that for Ethan Carter was the only standing ovation that had ever meant anything. In the months that followed, something shifted at Hartwell that was difficult to quantify in a performance review, but unmistakable in the texture of daily operations. The habit of asking changed. Engineers began walking the floor differently, not just reviewing dashboards and data outputs, but listening, the way Ethan listened. A suggestion process was established, genuinely anonymous, and genuinely read, and the ideas that came through it were often better than anyone had expected, because it turned out that the people closest to the machines had always had things to say and had simply never been asked. 3 significant process improvements in the first 2 quarters came directly from floor workers, people whose names had never appeared in a meeting agenda, whose voices had never been present in a strategy session, who had been, like Ethan, fluent in a language that the company had not previously bothered to hear. Sophia presented these improvements at the board meeting with the same directness she brought to everything. "We have been solving problems," she said, "by talking to the wrong people." Nobody in the boardroom argued. Ethan continued to work at Hartwell for years after that. He kept his own hours. He walked the floor with the same unhurried attention he had always brought to it. He fixed things that needed fixing and identified things that were about to need fixing. And he said what he knew when someone asked. And sometimes more now than before someone asked. He did not become a different person. He did not reclaim the career trajectory that he had set aside in the years after Laura died. He had made a decision once, in a quiet moment of reckoning, about the kind of life he wanted to live, and that decision remained his, and it remained right for him. What changed was only this. The world around him had learned, slowly and not without difficulty, to see what had always been there. There is a particular kind of intelligence that does not perform itself. It does not arrive with credentials displayed or volume raised. It does not wait to be invited into the important rooms. It exists in the same register as patience, quietly, completely, without needing to be acknowledged in order to remain true. Ethan Carter carried that intelligence through 3 years of invisible work before a machine's silence finally asked for it by name. He answered in 5 minutes. The factory ran. The contract was signed. And a CEO who had built her life on the certainty that talent announces itself learned something that none of the business schools she had attended had ever managed to teach her, that the most important things are often held by the quietest people, and that the first step toward any real solution is the willingness to stop assuming you already know where the answer lives. The machine on line 7 ran without interruption for a long time after that. And whenever a new engineer joined the team and made the rounds of the facility, someone would eventually point to that lower left panel, the small one, the size of a large book, with its 4 standard fasteners, and tell the story of the night it mattered. The story always ended the same way. Not with the $1 million saved, not with the contract won, not with the career revealed, or the standing ovation, or any of the things that make a story feel important from the outside. It ended with a man crouching in front of a machine in the middle of the night, putting his hand flat against the metal, and listening. Because that was where the answer had always been. Someone just had to be willing to be quiet enough to hear it. What very few people understood, and what Sophia came to understand only gradually, through conversations that happened over weeks and months, rather than in any single illuminating exchange, was the nature of the choice Ethan had made. It was easy to read his story as a tragedy of wasted potential. A man of exceptional capability reduced by grief to a life below his station, working nights in a factory that did not know what it had. That reading was available. It was also, Sophia eventually decided, wrong. Because Ethan had not been reduced. He had chosen. And there is a profound difference between those two things, even when they look identical from the outside. He had explained it to her, in the second or third of their quiet conversations in the small round table room, in the way that he explained most things simply, without adornment, without any apparent need for her to respond in a particular way. He said that after Laura died, he had spent a long time asking himself what he actually valued, not what he had been trained to value, not what his career had been organized around, not what the industry recognized and rewarded. What he actually valued, at the level where the question has real teeth. And the answer he had arrived at was something like this. He valued understanding. He valued the specific, tactile pleasure of knowing how a thing worked, not in the abstract, not on paper, but with his hands, in the physical world, in real time. He valued the honesty of mechanical systems, which fail in identifiable ways and are fixed by identifiable actions and do not lie to you. He valued quiet. He valued the ability to go home at the end of a shift and leave the shift behind. He had tried the alternative and found it consuming in a way that, in the years after Laura, he could not afford. Sophia listened to this and thought about her own life, the 12-hour days, the phone that was always on, the decisions that followed her home, and into the weekend, and into the early hours of the morning when she could not sleep. She had chosen all of it deliberately and continued to choose it, because the work fulfilled her in ways she could not fully articulate and did not need to. But she had never, before Ethan, encountered someone who had looked at the same category of opportunity and chosen differently without any apparent regret. It recalibrated something in her, not her ambition that remained intact, vigorous, essentially unchanged. What shifted was her assumption that her way of inhabiting a professional life was the only valid way. She had, without quite knowing it, been operating under the belief that the best people always want more. More scope, more visibility, more advancement. Ethan had shown her, quietly and without argument, that this was not universally true, and that her unexamined certainty about it had been costing her more than she knew. She thought about the 33 hours. She thought about all the hours before them, 3 years of night shifts, 3 years of a person with that depth of knowledge and that quality of attention walking the same factory floor, available, 3 years during which any number of smaller problems had been solved and larger ones had been prevented, invisibly, by hands that understood the machines far better than the people responsible for them. She would never be able to fully account for what Ethan's presence had meant to the facility during those 3 years. The catastrophes that had not happened, the failures caught early because someone had noticed something small, the institutional knowledge held quietly in one person's memory, never documented, never transferred, utterly irreplaceable. She added this to the lessons she was accumulating. The changes Sophia made to the company's culture were not dramatic in their implementation, because she had learned from Ethan that the things which actually work rarely announce themselves. There were no sweeping reorganizations, no consultants brought in to redesign the talent management process. She simply changed some habits. She began walking the floor herself, regularly, without an entourage, talking to the people whose names she had not previously known. She instituted a monthly session she called an open technical forum, which was exactly what it sounded like, an hour during which anyone from any level of the organization could raise a technical observation, a concern, an idea, without needing to route it through a manager or frame it in the language of a formal proposal. The sessions were awkward at first, because the people who had never been asked for their input were not immediately sure they were genuinely being invited. That changed over time. The third session produced a process modification, suggested by a second-shift line operator, that reduced material waste by 11%. The engineering team had not seen it. The line operator had been watching it for 2 years. Ethan attended those sessions occasionally when the topic was relevant to him. He never dominated them. He asked questions more often than he offered answers, which the engineers found, at first, slightly baffling. They had expected the expert to lecture, and found instead that he was curious. He was genuinely interested in what other people had noticed, because he understood that attention is distributed, that no single person sees everything, and that the most complete picture of a system is always assembled from multiple observations rather than one authoritative source. He had learned this not from any management philosophy but from years of working with machines, which do not present their failures to a single observer but leave evidence distributed across multiple surfaces, multiple readings, multiple small deviations that only cohere into a diagnosis when assembled together. The young engineer who had laughed his name was Derek Huang, 26 years old, 2 years out of a top-tier engineering program, full of the particular confidence of someone who has been consistently told he is exceptional, had a harder journey than most in the months following Line 7. He was not a bad person. He was, in many ways, genuinely talented. but he had been shaped by systems that rewarded the performance of certainty, the projection of competence, the visible assertion of status. He had laughed at Ethan because Ethan had looked like a category of person that his mental model told him did not have answers to questions that he and his colleagues had failed to solve. The laugh had been reflexive, unthought, and it had been, as he came to understand in slow and uncomfortable increments over the following months, a revelation of something he did not like about himself. He approached Ethan one afternoon about 4 months after the incident, in the part of the facility near the older equipment where Ethan spent time most afternoons. He had been thinking about how to have the conversation for some time, and had decided that the most honest approach was also the simplest. He said, "I owe you an apology." I laughed. "I shouldn't have." Ethan looked at him. "I know," he said. "It's fine." Derek shook his head slightly. "It's not, really. I made an assumption. I was wrong." There was a pause. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan nodded. "How did you know where to look?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I didn't know. I had a strong suspicion, based on experience. There's a difference." He paused. "The diagnostic systems are very good at finding failures that have happened before. They're not good at finding failures that are new. When you have a new failure mode, you have to go back to first principles. Forget the software. Forget the documentation. Ask what the machine is actually doing, not what the sensors say it's doing." Derek was quiet. "That's not in any training material I've ever read," he said. "No," Ethan agreed. "It isn't." Derek became, in the years that followed, one of the better engineers at Hartwell. Not because he was smarter than his peers, he was not. Or not by much, but because he had learned. At 26. A lesson that some people never learn at all, that the gap between knowing and understanding is wide, and that the only way across it is accumulated attention. He credited Ethan with this, in the direct way that young people credit the people who change their thinking, and Ethan received the credit with the mild discomfort of someone who was not entirely sure they had done anything deliberate. The spring afternoon when Sophia stood in the assembly building and told the company what had happened, told it plainly, without strategic framing, without the managed narrative that executives typically apply to stories about institutional failure, was one of the more unusual moments in Hartwell's history. Companies do not, as a rule, celebrate their near misses. They do not stand in front of their entire workforce and describe in specific detail the thing that almost destroyed them, and name the person who prevented it, and acknowledge what it meant about the quality of their attention. Sophia did it because she believed that the only way to change a culture was to be honest about what the culture had actually been. Anything less was management theater. And management theater produces the appearance of change without its substance. The response in the room that day was not uniformly comfortable. Some of the senior engineers found it difficult to sit with the specificity of the account. A few of them had been in that room. Some of them had been among those who exchanged glances when Ethan raised his hand. The story, told clearly and without softening, was a precise and somewhat unsparing record of their collective failure of perception, not a failure of technical skill, but a failure of the imagination required to consider that the answer might live somewhere unexpected. That is a harder failure to acknowledge than a calculation error or a missed specification. It says something about the shape of your assumptions that most people would prefer not to examine closely. But the younger workers, the newer engineers, the floor operators, the people who had been standing at the edges of the organization for years received it differently. They received it the way people receive the acknowledgement of something they have long known to be true but had no reason to believe would be publicly admitted. Several of them found Ethan afterward and said things to him that he received with varying degrees of grace. A woman named Patricia Chen, who had been running quality control on Line 3 for 4 years, shook his hand and said, "There are a lot of us who knew things we were never asked about." Ethan looked at her. "I know," he said. "Talk to Sophia." She did. In the end, what Line 7 produced was not simply the resumption of manufacturing output, though it produced that too. It produced a shift in the epistemology of a company, a change in the shared understanding of where knowledge lives and how to find it. It is not a story about a hidden genius finally recognized, though it contains that element. It is not a story about a CEO's failure of judgment, though it contains that too. It is a story about attention, about the quality of attention a person or an institution brings to the world, and what it costs when that attention is organized around assumptions about who knows things and who does not. The thermal coupling relay that had been at the center of all of it was decommissioned as a display item after the system was updated to the next generation of components. Sophia kept it on the windowsill of the small round-table room, next to the parking lot window. It was not labeled. Visitors to the room occasionally picked it up, turned it over, set it down without curiosity. It was, to all appearances, a small piece of industrial equipment. A relay, the size of a deck of playing cards, the kind of thing a person could hold in one hand and not think about for a single second. The kind of thing a very experienced man with a flathead screwdriver and 33 hours of everyone else's failure behind him had quietly fixed in 5 minutes on a Tuesday night in a factory that had decided it didn't know the answer. It had known the answer the whole time. It just needed someone who knew how to listen.